welcome to another episode of Quick Hits. I'm your host, Ken Booth, joined as always by Tyler Smith. Tyler, how are things going this week?
Great, Ken. Great to be here with you.
Yeah, you too. Tyler, normally, we normally have the guest introduce themselves, but today I'm actually going to introduce our guest. Today's guest, Jeremy Schwach, launched his entrepreneurial journey as a 19-year-old, founding a transportation firm during his freshman year at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. He later served as an executive at Epic, the EMR giant based out of Wisconsin, and he played a pivotal role at Bluetree, growing it from a small startup to a force of over 600 employees. After selling Bluetree to Tegria, Jeremy was recognized as one of Glassdoor's top 10 U.S. CEOs in 2021, and also happy to announce that he is currently serving as a member of the Health Data Movers Board of Directors. So, Jeremy, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
You know, we thought today we would talk a little bit about, well, first of all, we'd love to know what you're doing right now.
I've got my hands in a whole bunch of stuff. I'm pretty engaged in the behavioral health space. So we got some companies there, both sort of brick and mortar and on the tech side. And after taking a few years off after the last company was acquired, I've sort of dove back into the startup world. So many members of my former team and I are kind of building our next healthcare company.
Oh, excellent. Okay. Well, glad to hear it. You know, that's a person like you can always, you're always busy, right? And that's kind of what we wanted to talk about, that grind mindset that you have. You know, clearly you've always been interested in starting companies and starting businesses. But I thought we'd start off by asking, you know, how would you define the culture that you try to create in these businesses that you've helped form and grow?
Tyler knows I'm going to sound like a broken record. I kind of have one philosophy, and it's like, if you get the best people, you're probably going to win. And so that's it, right? How do you get the best people? How do you sort of get everybody engaged? And if you can do that, you kind of just got to get out of the way. And so that's really been my strategy with almost all the businesses. Both I've just been a part of it and I've run. I think it just comes down to that sort of simple mantra. And we've been able to thankfully have a lot of success because I think we found some great humans.
Well, let's dive into that a little bit. So when you say that you're looking for the best people and great humans, like what are you looking for? What are some of the qualities that you look for?
There's a lot of nuance to it, but at the super high level, I'd say, number one is just sort of that key. Are we aligned on sort of mission and values? So no one wants to work with folks they don't like. And so that's sort of number one. And then two, at least what I've seen, the folks that tend, at least in sort of smaller companies that tend to do a great job are the self-starters. So we look for folks that can roll up their sleeves, can get a bunch of stuff done and work really well with other humans. And it seems like a pretty no nonsense pretty obvious way to go about life. And it's just shocking to me how many companies screw this up. Either because they're not hiring a lot of people, they're looking for the rock star who, maybe is pissing a bunch of people off, or they make some mistakes and they don't fix those mistakes. And so they end up with sort of cultures of mediocrity. And I think that's a really good way to build a mediocre company.
So you would agree that a lot of companies start off with that mindset, but then it just kind of degrades over time to just this culture of mediocrity then?
Yeah, I think the key is you've got to get, in startup land, it's all about the first 10 people. Can you get the right 10 people who are super hard workers, they're smart, and probably most importantly, they sort of believe in whatever the mission, whatever the vision of that organization is. And then two, are they collaborative in nature? Because ultimately all work is collaborative work now. Sure. Right, especially sort of services-based work in healthcare. And so we've been sort of focused on get the first 10 people. And then what happens is those 10 people are the ones that hire the next 100. Right?
Gotcha.
So you can get sort of that culture working at 10, you can do a lot of great stuff.
Does that, for you, do those 10 people need to be together in the same room? Or are you a fan of the remote space that's kind of grown from the pandemic where, and I realize a lot of companies are trying to pull back on that a little bit, but what do you think about remote work as a whole? Does that contribute or does that hinder the culture a little bit?
It always seems silly to me to use geographic boundaries as sort of a limiter. So if your main orientation, priority 1 and 2 is get the best, most aligned people, then it always felt weird to me to use geography as sort of a limiter. So we started the last company fully remote. We're starting this company fully remote. Because again, our goal is to get the best humans. And if we can, look as far away as, California and Alaska and and Miami. I'm down here in Miami. We've got folks in
Nice.
Denver, Colorado. We always felt like, man, that's the way to get the best people, because your pipeline can be, a million times larger.
Yeah. Wow. Awesome. Hey, I love to hear that attitude because, yeah, it is about getting the best people, and you can collaborate. If you've got a good rapport, you can collaborate over distances. So excellent. I guess the next question I have for you is, when it comes to that company culture, how can a person kind of adopt that culture in their own personal productivity? So let's say, our audience is a lot of people who are looking to be consultants, or they're currently consultants, and they might work for various different, healthcare organizations. What do you think are takeaways that a person can apply individually to themselves to improve their own productivity, or even the way that they work or collaborate with others?
I don't. The answer is I don't know. At least the philosophy in my life, again, I don't think there's a lot of rocket science here. I sort of buy into the 10,000 hour rule. I think doing something over and over a lot and making lots of mistakes and being sort of vulnerable about those mistakes, that's sort of the only way to get good at anything.
Mhm.
You just have to do a lot of it. And some people have sort of a natural inclination, with certain skills. But at the end of the day, I think the harder you work, the more you're doing something, just the better you're going to get at it. And I don't know that there's a lot of shortcuts to that. So that's sort of how I've sort of approached. I think the other thing, which I honestly think American culture does a pretty good job with, and if you go overseas, it's a lot harder. You can fail a lot, I think, in our culture, and that's sort of become an acceptable thing. And I think it's still hard individually, but if you can sort of embrace that, I think sort of naturally, I'm not really risk averse, so. Like I do a lot of stuff and I screw up a lot of the stuff, and then I just keep going. And I think that's like a big part of life. So if you can build a culture where that's acceptable, I ran this bus company in college. I only ever talk about the one that worked, that didn't work. And I probably wouldn't have had, Mad Bus, which is the name of the company that actually worked, but I had a bunch of companies that, failed miserably through that process. And
let's talk a failure. Let's dive. Yeah, let's hear about a failure. One that taught you the biggest lesson.
Like they've all taught me lessons, but so I was 18. I was at University of Wisconsin. There's a whole bunch of students, so there was reciprocity between Minnesota and Wisconsin, which meant if you were from Minnesota like me, you got to pay in-state tuition. I think they've been trying to close that loophole for like 1,000 years, because Wisconsin's a better school, so there's just more Minnesotan kids going across the border. But there wasn't a great way to get home, and so I built a bus company. And didn't know what the heck I was doing and made a ton of mistakes. And then I was like, oh, this should work in the reverse, and it should work in Boston out to Amherst, and none of those worked. So basically, only one that I built actually worked. The rest of them failed for like lots of different reasons. One, I didn't really know how to scale at that time. I wasn't really a process thinker. It was just me doing a lot of work. Two, I wasn't that deliberate on research. I just sort of started them to see what happened. I tried to start a moving company sort of attached to the bus company, which also didn't work. So yeah, I was sort of out there trying a bunch of stuff. And again, no one sort of remembers any of those.
Hey, Jeremy, yeah, I do appreciate how much you've been able to impart your wisdom, and even listeners can probably tell right now your experience is super, super deep. But curious, how did you get to be such a good coach?
I mean, I don't actually see myself as a good coach, so I appreciate the compliment. So I don't really have any answers. I started my career at Epic. I mean, I think the world of Epic. I think what Judy Faulkner's created there in the middle of Wisconsin is pretty amazing. And the base philosophy of Epic, right? You look at who Epic's hiring; it's just smart kids, right? And so you get Epic has created a culture where they bring in a lot of smart people who don't know a lot of stuff, and they train them, right? And they give them ample opportunity. Like when I was 27 at Epic running super large implementation, I remember being on a phone with a CIO who had 30 more years of experience with me. And I was like, I was Googling words that he was saying because I honestly didn't think what he was talking about. I'm like, how did I get here? This makes no sense. But I think that culture makes a ton of sense, right? If you can get smart people and train them up, but also give them like a good amount of autonomy and flexibility to go try stuff and fail. Like what better way to build a company? And obviously Epic's success kind of speaks for itself.
Sure. Yeah,
So I
absolutely.
don't know. That lived experience, I think, is invaluable.
Mm.
I've realized that I'm actually a terrible interviewer, and so I do very few interviews.
Hmm.
I've sort of honed in on. I'm not actually that good at a lot of stuff. There are a few things I'm like pretty good at sales. Like for some reason, I'm good at finding sort of a good core. But there's a ton of stuff I'm not good at. And so the other thing I've sort of learned over time, I was doing a lot of stuff in the early day, 10,000 hour rule, like diving in. I think over the last decade plus, I've learned that there's only a couple things I'm good at. And pretty much everything else, if I can find someone who's better at me at that, then I should let them do it.
Hmm.
And that includes like a very long laundry list of stuff, including interviewing. So I found people that I feel like are much better at sort of spotting talent than I am.
Hmm.
And so they do the interviews. And so usually when I'm jumping on an interview, I'm the hype man because that's what I'm good at. So, and now that my team knows that, right? So they'll give me an interview and then they'll give me the context and they'll say, your job, we already know we want this person. Your job is to sell this person. And like, I'm really good at that. Going back to sort of your question on spotting talent, I'm not sure I'm great at doing that. One trait I have, which I would argue is as much of a blessing as is a curse. I'm fairly trusting overall. I think that plays well in general in business.
Hmm.
Like what I found over time is if you're trusting people, a lot of times they will surprise you, and you get to realize their potential because you're trusting them to do stuff. And then also the world's small, and you're not just working with one person one time in one context. What I found is life is long and you're seeing lots of the same people over and over. And so if you're trusting people generally, that seems to come back around quite a bit. On the other side, like I've screwed up a lot because I'm maybe too trusting than I should have been. And I've made sort of mistakes on hires and keeping people too long and all the fun stuff that goes with that. But I don't know, that seems to be a trait that's sort of, worked well for me over the years.
I think it's admirable that you acknowledge where your weaknesses are and you just bring in the people to kind of shore you up in that respect.
I don't want to say this out loud, too many times. If you're like mediocre at a lot of stuff and you find people who are great at those things to compliment you, you just don't have to work as hard either. Right? Like I remember having this experience as I was figuring this out where, as we got the first company off the ground and, we sort of got recruiting going and sales going and delivery going, there were moments in that time where the team was effectively told me to get out of the way. Like, hey, you don't know our processing anymore. We've hired all these rock stars in recruiting. You're like a good recruiter, but like you're no longer the best recruiter. And also you're not following anything we're doing and you're getting in the way. So it'd be good if you just maybe stopped doing it. And that was the moment I was like, oh, this is great. Like I don't have to do this thing anymore because it's working better than I could possibly have made it work. So this was definitely a learning. I think it's really hard to get out of the way. It's also hard to see your own blind spots. If I knew what my blind spots are, I would have already fixed them. And so you sort of need people around you that are telling you, hey, maybe you shouldn't be doing this thing anymore.
Have you always been able to accept that feedback from others, or did that kind of come over time?
No, yeah, it came over time. I think like everything else, it's sort of a learned skill. We invested in this thing at the last company called Fierce. And we just sort of realized one of the things we weren't great at as a company, and companies are often reflections of their leaders, was sort of giving feedback. Like we had a lot of Midwest Nice. So we invested in a tool that was sort of a training that helped, like with the tools, how do you give feedback? How do you receive feedback? And sort of through that process, we sort of learned, this is a learned skill like everything else. And you have to practice that skill. And if you don't, then you're never going to get good at it. Mm-hmm. And it's hard to grow as a human. It's also hard to grow an organization if you don't know what you're good at, but also if you don't know what you aren't good at. And I would argue most organizations are just not very good at fostering that.
Jeremy, again, I always go back to the coaching. I'm curious though, as to who are some of your mentors or maybe some of the folks that you looked up to. You mentioned Judy, incredible leader, incredible builder, but wondering who else, or maybe even if it's not long-term, who recently you've been kind of vibing off of.
Yeah. So yeah, going back to coaching, I think one thing I've found, I sit on HCM's boards and a couple other boards and advisory positions. The learned experience is hard. It's sort of hard to replace. And so I think some of quote unquote being a good coach is just being able to sort of rehash some of the things you've screwed up. I think one of the more powerful ways to sort of give advice is just to root them in your own experiences. And I'm part of YPO, and that's sort of a YPO forum philosophy, right? You're never really supposed to give advice, but you are supposed to sort of take a situation and figure out to apply it to your own life, and then sort of communicate it that way. And I think that's really powerful. So I don't know that I know a ton of stuff, but I do know that I've screwed a ton of stuff up in the past. And so if I can help couch some of what someone's going through in what I've gone through, that sometimes those seem to resonate. And then I think, the success I've had on my own coaches or mentors in my life, it's sort of been similar. So I worked very closely with a gentleman named Ken Bloom, who is the chair of our board at our last company. And he's an incredible human that has been in healthcare, for 50 plus years, basically across public health, across provider health. He was like literally living in a mud hut in the Congo, eradicating smallpox when he was like 21. He's just an incredible human. And because he has all these wild experiences, he has got a lot of wisdom to part, even if he doesn't necessarily understand the current state of the tech. He just has a lot of wisdom that he can impart based on what he's seen. I just don't think there's any replacement for that sort of experience.
Nice.
AI, Jeremy, what's your latest take? I feel like you've always got a new take, and this space evolves every day. But anything you're nerding out on an AI as of today?
It's like probably every other, we're in the normal cycle. You have the hype cycle. We'll probably head to the trough of disillusionment, and then we'll pop back up. So I don't have any real insights. I do. I mean, there's something here, right? I think if you're a business, especially a services business, that's not thinking about how AI is going to change your business, then that's a huge mistake. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of noise to dig through. It's incredibly hard to figure out how to actually apply in real business sense. And businesses that are constantly experimenting with it are going to find really interesting use cases, I think. And so that's like the current insight. The other gem, which is not mine, it's just recycled. We have a really great AI advisor who has he's on his third company. His last company was a ML company, machine learning company in the airline space. So it was call centers for airlines. And what he says is, we're on our third wave of AI hype. Most of the things that most businesses want to do with AI, they have been able to do for a decade. And so a lot of the things that new businesses want to do with AI, they've already been able to do. The challenge there is just it's hard like everything else in life. Like the idea is secondary to execution. And so he's sort of beating into us like, yes, you'll be able to use generative AI. Like there's a huge opportunity in healthcare, obviously around, chatbots and weeding through data, and a lot of like the skills. A patient wants to do something, a physician wants to do something, a nurse wants to do something, and now you sort of go do that in the EMR or somewhere else. You've been able to do that for a very long time. It's just very hard to execute on. And so I sort of like that advice. Like at the end of the day, like the execution is the only thing that matters. Mm-hmm. I'd also say it's already commoditized, right? Mm-hmm. OpenAI is commoditized. 50% of the business out of YC are building on top of OpenAI. Most of the companies I'm talking to coming out of the various accelerators I'm talking to are building on top of OpenAI. Many want to move to, Facebook's open llama source, but at the end of the day, it's really commoditized. Mm-hmm. And so then you got to figure out, well, how do I actually build something that has a moat? And I think the way to do that is you have to get really, really narrow in a use case. Mm. And it's not like no good, my opinion, most of the good quote unquote AI companies are going to be AI plus something, AI plus service, AI plus like a really good wrapper. Because if you're just sort of AI, you're a commodity. My favorite use case in healthcare right now is faxing. So you guys are in healthcare, so most organizations still fax.
Still fax.
And there's I don't know that there's good reasons for it, but there are reasons that have a lot to do with, incentives and arcane technology. And, pharmacies don't want to use SureScripts and pay the transaction fee. It's still cheaper for them to shoot a fax over. So if we can't get off of faxes, we've been talking about getting off faxes for 20 years. We're not getting off faxes anytime soon, is my opinion. However, what better use for generative AI than fax? Right? The robot can read the fax. It can make sense of the fax. It can figure out how to route the fax, and then probably do something with some action based on the fax. That's a really good use case for AI. And so we're actually in the process of talking to a company right now that is doing just this. And we think it's like an incredible use case. And there's a lot of ways to bolt it on to all sorts of other sort of solutions that we're sort of working on. So I think that's like genius, because you can take something that's really commoditized and like anybody could use generative AI to like read faxes. But the real magic here is sort of taking and embedding it in workflow and really understanding the use cases. And there's probably some semblance of services that you have to wrap around it. So I think AI is probably a little bit overhyped right now, but there will be tons and tons of use cases just like this that will prove themselves out over the next couple of years.
Some final words of wisdom, Jeremy, from you, just like, inspire us, and then Tyler, the same from you, and then we'll let the audience go.
I mean, I always tell Tyler this, like, ultimately we're running businesses, and businesses are just people organizations. And if you're running a services business, you're even more of a people organization than that. And so if you can figure out how to get the best people, build a culture where people are super engaged, like working with their colleagues, that's half the battle. So I don't think there's any rocket science in this world. I think that's sort of the magic. And it's just hard to execute.
Spoken like a coach. Tyler, anything from you?
I just want to say I couldn't be more grateful to Jeremy. As you can tell, he's extremely humble, but not only does he impart lessons, but he's also generous with repetition, because sometimes my thick skull doesn't register. So it's really beneficial that he's humble, has the experience to share, and repeats the experience and the lessons. And that way, ideally, when we're building companies like HDM, we can repeat some of the successes, learn from some of the mistakes, and create an amazing environment for folks to work together.
Absolutely. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for taking some time out of your day. Jeremy, I know you're a really busy guy, so I really appreciate the value of your time that you've spent with Tyler and I. And we'll ask everyone to do me a favor, go out, check out Jeremy on LinkedIn. He's posted some pretty interesting articles, and I'll post some links as well to those posts as well, Jeremy. So again, just want to thank you for joining us, and ladies and gentlemen, we'll see you on the next episode of Quick Hits.